It begins in the cradle of desolation, amidst the parched earth and jagged hills of Dedebit, a land untouched by the excesses of modernity, where time itself seemed reluctant to advance. Here, in the vast expanse of western Tigray, 11 young men made a choice that would reverberate through history. They turned their backs on the familiar comforts of academia, abandoned the lecture halls and libraries of universities, and ventured into the wilderness. 11 students, bound not by convenience but by conviction, stood at the precipice of an audacious dream, the creation of the Tigray People's Liberation Front. It was a decision heavy with consequence, one that carried the weight of their people's history, their struggles, and their aspirations. From the closest major city, Shirre, the journey to Dedebit today might only take an hour, but at the time, it was a long and arduous track. The roads were rough, the distances unrelenting, and every step forward was a reminder of the challenges ahead. For these young men, this was not a journey for travel, but a crossing into a new chapter of struggle and purpose. Dedebit was not merely a destination, it was a crucible, a place where dreams would be tested against the harsh realities of survival. Their initial goal was not victory, nor glory, but survival. Survival in the face of overwhelming odds, armed with nothing but the art of guerrilla warfare. To remain elusive, to be shadows upon the land, constantly on the move. This was their strategy. Yet, the greatest challenge was not the harshness of the land, or even the might of their adversaries. It was the skepticism of their own people. Skepticism rooted in years of broken promises and failed attempts from previous resistance movements. How could this small band of unseasoned youths succeed where others had faltered? To understand the war, we must first understand the foundation upon which it was built. Wars do not appear from nowhere. They are born from decades of discontent, of suffering, of power teetering on the edge of collapse. The Ethiopian Empire was no exception. The 1950s. The Ethiopian Empire, still ruled by Emperor Haile Selassie, was beginning to show its cracks. Power belonged to the aristocracy, a closed circle of elites who governed with absolute authority. But behind the grandeur of the imperial palace, behind the gold-threaded robes and rigid traditions, was a storm brewing. Many within the ruling class saw the stagnation of the empire. They recognized the growing frustrations, widening gap between the governed and the governing. Yet their hands were tied. Reform was not an option under Haile Selassie. The emperor's grip on power was absolute. Dissent was not merely ignored, it was crushed. Spies lurked in the halls of power, ensuring that even whispers of discontent never grew into full voices. The 1960s brought with it more than political unease. It brought a rising tide of resistance. The economy struggled, opportunities dwindled, people grew relentless. Student movement emerged, radical and unrelenting, demanding land reform, democracy, and freedom from the suffocating grip of imperial rule. They took to the streets, their voices ringing through the city, calling for change, and the empire responded the only way it knew how, with force. The military, once a tool for external defense, became an instrument of suppression. Troops were not sent out to battle foreign threats, but to silence their own people, and in doing so, the emperor had sown the seeds of his own undoing. Then came the moment that shook the empire, December 1960. The Imperial Guard, long seen as a symbol of the emperor's strength, turned their guns inward. They attempted a coup, a desperate bid to unseat Haile Selassie, bring about a new Ethiopia. But the empire was not yet ready to fall. The military stood divided. The coup was crushed. The emperor remained. But something had changed. The military, once a loyal instrument of the throne, had now glimpsed its own power. It had become clear. Haile Selassie ruled only as long as the army allowed him to. Through the 1960s and 70s, the Ethiopian military transformed. The recruitment of educated Ethiopians into the armed forces introduced radical ideas. Soldiers who once had sworn unwavering loyalty to the emperor were now questioning the very system they served. With every protest they had ordered to suppress, with every peasant uprising they were sent to crush, they saw the fractures in the empire widen. And then the tipping point arrived. The early 1970s, a nation in crisis. The empire was no longer merely stagnating, it was collapsing. The economy crumbled, the cost of living soared, and famine spread across the land.
There comes a time when we heed a certain call, when the world must come together as one. There are people dying. Oh, when it's time to lend a hand to life, the greatest gift of all. We can't go on pretending day by day that someone somewhere will soon make a change. We all a part of God's great big family. And the truth, you know, love is all we need. Beyond the world, beyond the children, beyond the ones who make a brighter day. So let's start giving. There's a choice we're making. We're saving our own lives. It's true, we make a better day, just you and me. Well, send them your heart, so they know that someone cares, and their lives will be stronger and free, as God has shown us by turning stone to bread.
For those in power, these crimes were little more than dissent concerns. The emperor, surrounded by lavish wealth, appeared indifferent to the suffering of his people, and the army, the very force he relied upon for survival, began to turn against him. By 1974, it was no longer a question of if Haile Selassie would fall, it was only a question of when. When the military finally made its move, it came not from high-ranking generals or powerful aristocrats. It came from within, from the very soldiers who had once been his enforcers. September 12, 1974, the Ethiopian monarchy, the oldest in the world, came to an end. The Derg, a committee of low-ranking military officers, seized power, declaring the birth of a new era, and with that, the empire was no more. But revolutionaries are rarely the endings they promise to be. The fall of the emperor was not the beginning of peace, it was the beginning of something far more chaotic, far more violent. The Derg did not simply take over. They reshaped the entire state, adopting Marxist-Leninist ideology. They abolished the monarchy and declared Ethiopia a socialist state. What followed was the nationalization of industries. The people had fought to replace one dictatorship with another. At the time, the people of Tigray looked upon these young revolutionaries with doubt, even derision. How could students, untried, untested, even defend against the local bandits, men who terrorized and looted at will? And how, they wondered, could such an unassuming group dare to challenge the iron grip of the central government, a monolith of power with resources that dwarfed their own? The skepticism was not unfounded. These young revolutionaries were stepping into a landscape scared by mistrust, where hope was a rare and fragile commodity. Yet, against the tide of disbelief, the organization set out to forge a bond with the people. They knew that survival was not merely a matter of tactics, but of trust. Trust was their currency, their shield, and their weapon. While their movements remained fluid and elusive, they spread their simple message. We do not and cannot promise you an immediate victory, but together, with time and your support, we can plant the seeds of resistance, nurture them, and watch them grow into a force capable of confronting the great machine of oppression. It was a promise both humble and bold, one that spoke not only to the practicality of their struggle, but to the enduring spirit of their people. The trust was not given freely, it was earned. The TPLF wove itself into the fabric of Tigrayan life, offering protection where there was none, and a vision where there was despair. Slowly, the lines between the fighters and the people blurred, as the two became one in purpose and resolve. Through shared hardship and mutual reliance, they forged a bond that would become the foundation of their resistance. From the ashes of doubt and the crucible of survival, the TPLF began its journey. What started as a desperate bid for existence in the hills of Dedebit would, in time, become a movement that reshaped the destiny of a people. But in those early days, survival was enough, and survival they achieved. For in the act of enduring, they kindled a flame of hope, a flame that would one day burn bright enough to light the path of freedom. In the formative years of the TPLF, the organization began to grow rapidly. What had initially been a small band of 11 revolutionaries transformed into a collective force numbering in the hundreds. They were an amalgamation of society's diverse strata, students and intellectuals, farmers and laborers, townsfolk and villagers. Their shared purpose was to challenge the established order and carve a new path toward freedom and self-determination. Yet, as their number grew, so did the magnitude of their challenges. The issue of armaments was particularly pressing. Their arsenal consisted largely of firearms that belonged to an earlier era, rifles and pistols dating back to World War II, and in some cases even World War I. Automatic weapons were scarce, and ammunition was a constant source of concern. They faced an adversary equipped with far superior weaponry, but the ingenuity and resourcefulness of the TPLF compensated for their material deficiencies. Capturing supplies from their enemies became both a necessity and a strategy. Each bullet recovered, each rifle salvaged was a step forward in their struggle. Despite these material limitations, the TPLF began to earn the trust of the people they sought to serve. In the rural hinterlands, where banditry and state neglect had long plagued the population, the presence of the TPLF brought a semblance of order and security. This burgeoning truth was further amplified in urban centers, where the ideals of the movement resonated strongly with the educated youth. Students, driven by a sense of purpose and inspired by the TPLF's vision, joined the cause in growing numbers, bringing them intellectual vigor and organizational skills. The influx of new members necessitated a re-evaluation of the organization's structure and decision-making processes. The TPLF's commitment to democratic principles was not merely aspirational, it was a foundational element to their identity. Decisions were made collectively, with debates held and votes cast to determine the best course of action, and representatives were appointed to articulate the views of those unable to attend. This practice was a radical departure from the authoritarian norms that had long dominated Ethiopian governance and politics. From these debates emerged the framework of a Congress, a forum where differences could be aired, ideas could be exchanged, and consensus could be reached. In its nascent stages, the Congress consisted of around 70 to 80 participants, a mix of fighters, leaders, and newly inducted members. This first group of elected leaders, numbering approximately 14 or 15 people, was entrusted with the responsibility of guiding the organization through these formative years. Though modest in scale, these gatherings represented a transformative movement, introducing democratic practices into a region where such principles had rarely, if ever, been implemented. As the TPLF expanded, it became clear that beyond ideological unity and military resistance, the movement needed organization at all levels of society. The primary objectives were threefold. First, educating and informing the people about the political and social struggle. Second, structuring the organization so that all groups, including women, farmers, and students, had clear roles and representation. And third, ensuring that communities could defend themselves. One of the most significant initiatives to emerge from this period was the establishment of local governing bodies called bitos. These councils functioned as mini-governments, resolving disputes, addressing crime, and handling societal issues within their communities. There were hundreds of bitos all over the Tigray region. These structures allowed the people to take an active role in governance. A crucial factor in the TPLF's ability to organize and expand was the prevalence of firearm ownership among the population. In many rural communities, it was common for individuals and households to possess weapons for personal protection, hunting, and safeguarding their livestock. The TPLF recognized the potential in this existing culture of armament and sought to channel it into an organized defense structure. Instead of viewing firearms as individual assets, they introduced the idea of collective security, training villagers to form militias that would not only protect their own homes, but also contribute to the broader struggle against the state forces. Communities were encouraged to organize their own units, elect local leaders, and received some training from TPLF. The objective was to create a decentralized yet coordinated defense network, ensuring that each village could stand its ground while also reinforcing neighboring regions when necessary. This level of grassroots organization allowed the TPLF to extend its influence far beyond its immediate numbers, as entire villages became active participants in the struggle. Militias played an essential role in intelligence gathering, defense coordination, and resistance operations. Their familiarity with the terrain gives them an advantage over the enemy, allowing them to launch effective ambushes, relay critical information, and disrupt enemy supply lines. In addition to establishing local governance and militias, the TPLF formalized its decision-making process through a congress known as Gubbai. This congress was not merely a symbolic institution, but a structured political forum that guided the movement's trajectory. Representatives from different communities all over Tigray participated, bringing diverse perspectives and ensuring that the movement remained responsive to the needs of its base. While other student movements had experimented with democratic principles before, this was the first large-scale political entity in Tigray that functioned on the basis of structured debates and representation. The Eritrean People's Liberation Front, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party. Three movements, three visions, three very different understandings of Ethiopia's identity. Their differences shaped the course of history, and their clashes would define the fate of a nation. These groups weren't simply rebels fighting against the central authority. They were architects, each designing a separate blueprint for what Ethiopia, or in some cases, what the Horn of Africa, should be. The Eritrean People's Liberation Front. To them, Ethiopia was not a country they belonged to, it was an occupier. Their ideology was simple. Eritrea was its own entity, its own nation, and its presence within Ethiopia was nothing more than an arrangement forced upon them. Their mission was singular and unwavering, complete and absolute independence. There was no room for negotiation, no possibility of a federal arrangement, no consideration of shared governance. Eritrea, in their eyes, was a nation kidnapped, and they would stop at nothing to ensure its liberation. Regarding democratic principles, the EPLF strayed far. Within their own ranks, discussion and debate were not the way decisions were made. Their leadership was authoritarian, their tactics uncompromising. And this is where the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, stood apart. TPLF believed that decisions should be made by the people they affected. For example, regarding Eritrean independence, it wasn't about what the Ethiopian government wanted, or even what the EPLF wanted. It was what the Eritrean people themselves wanted. They believed the best course of action was a referendum held in Eritrea, letting the people decide whether or not they want independence. A stark contrast to the EPLF's unilateral stance. This idea wasn't just a diplomatic position, it was an extension of TPLF's broader belief in self-determination. Additionally, the EPRP's approach to revolution was radically different from the TPLF's rural guerrilla tactics, or EPLF's border-focused war. The EPRP believed in urban uprisings, swift, concentrated attacks in the heart of Ethiopia's cities to topple the regime from within. The capital of Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, was their stronghold, their battlefield. They believed that victory in the capital would send shockwaves throughout the country, bringing immediate change. But the Derg saw these uprisings as the greatest eternal threat. His response? Kewani, the Red Terror. Death to the counter-revolutionaries, death to the EPRP. These were the words Mengistu shouted to the crowd as he threw and shattered bottles filled with a red liquid, which he said were symbols of the blood that would soon flood the streets of Addis Ababa. It was a declaration of war, not against a foreign enemy, but against Ethiopia's own people. Kewani, or the Red Terror, was not a campaign of battles between armies. It was a purge, a systematic, calculated extermination of dissenters, real or imagined. What some had expected to be a brief confrontation now stretched into a long and grinding war. The realization set in, this was not going to be a sprint, it's going to be a marathon. A test of endurance, patience, and adaptability. Slowly, most within the TPLF came to accept a new reality. This was a war that could take years, even decades. The way they fought had to change. The mindset of the movement had to change. It was not just about resistance anymore, it was about survival. For 10 years, the Derg waged war against the rebellions. It wasn't just a war, it was a systematic effort to crush dissent, to erase opposition. 7 large-scale military campaigns, each meant to do one thing: annihilate those who dared resist. And for the Derg, one enemy took priority above all others. The Derg's tactics can be summarized in one phrase: የኤርትራን ኃይል ለመደምሰስ እና የትግራይ ኃይል ለመዳሰስ. This roughly means destroy the forces in Eritrea and undermine the forces in Tigray. As in the eyes of the Derg, Eritrea was the real war, the existential threat. Tigray, that was an inconvenience, an uprising they believed could be crushed as a side operation. These campaigns weren't conventional wars fought on open plains. Derg threw everything they had: infantry divisions, heavy artillery, and newly trained mountain warfare units. He brought in fighter helicopters, which he also used against civilian population. The TPLF adapted. Guerrilla warfare wasn't a choice, it was survival. They shifted strategies constantly. One moment in retreat, the next launching precise counterattacks. The battlefield was never static, and neither were they. More north, a larger battle was unfolding. In Eritrea, the EPLF was locked in a brutal struggle against the same enemy. Derg was focused on crushing Eritrean forces, pouring men and resources into the fight. 3 divisions of TPLF fighters moved north, aiding and joining the front lines in Eritrea. The logic was clear. If the Derg was committed to Eritrea, then TPLF had to be there. Their assistance was twofold: helping to reinforce their allies while stretching the Derg's forces thin. More fronts the Derg had to fight on, the weaker they became. Once EPLF forces were strong enough to hold their own, TPLF divisions returned to Tigray to continue the fight there. They assisted the EPLF forces as they were their allies, but it was also because if Eritrea fell, they were next. For most of the first 10 years, the TPLF played defense. Derg had numbers, the Derg had firepower, the TPLF had strategy. They didn't fight for territory, they fought to survive, to bleed the enemy, to stretch them thin until the moment was right. War was long, it was brutal, and for the TPLF, it was only just the beginning. 7 campaigns, 10 years, and yet the Derg still hadn't won it. If anything, the enemy they had dismissed, the one they thought they could undermine, was only getting stronger. And soon the fight would change. The hunted would become the hunters, and for the first time, the Derg would find itself on the defense. For the majority of the first decade, the TPLF employed a defensive strategy. They struck where they could, retreated when necessary, and survived as the Derg overwhelmed them with superior firepower, numbers, and resources. But endurance alone was not enough. The Derg had to be defeated, not simply resisted. And after 10 years of struggle, the leadership of the TPLF gathered, analyzed their experience, and agreed. A fundamental shift in doctrine and strategy was needed. would not fight in the same way anymore. The war had to be redefined. The new doctrine. The first doctrine they adopted was a bold one. No action taken by the TPLF could violate any sort of human rights. In an era where war was synonymous with brutality, this principle was radical. It meant that captured Derg soldiers would be treated with dignity. It meant that civilians, even in enemy-held territory, would be respected. The goal was clear: to defeat the Derg, not terrorize the population. The Derg, on the other hand, had no such reservations. In towns where they suspected TPLF movement, they forced civilians to act against them, bringing them to shout, throw stones, physically resist the TPLF soldiers. It was a cruel strategy, as it risked the lives of everyday people. But the TPLF remained steadfast. If a town was being used against them, they would not retaliate. They maneuvered around, avoiding unnecessary conflict, and ensured that their fight remained against the Derg itself, not the people. This principle extended beyond battles. The TPLF understood that the war was not just about who controlled the battlefield, but who controlled the narrative. If they acted with integrity, if they honored human rights, they would gain the trust and support of the people. And in a war where survival was dependent on the willingness of communities to shelter, feed, and support the fighters, trust was not just a moral ideal, it was a strategic necessity. This second doctrine was an acceptance of reality. The TPLF would never have more weapons, more ammunition, or more soldiers than the Derg. They would always be outnumbered, always be outgunned. Numbers alone do not win wars. Belief does. The TPLF fighters were not conscripts. They were volunteers, people who chose to fight for something greater than themselves. They fought for justice, for freedom, for the right to exist without persecution. And because of this, they were more resilient, more determined, and more committed. This belief in quality over quantity reshaped their entire strategy. Direct confrontations were avoided. Instead, the TPLF embraced surprise attacks, night raids, and battlefield deception. They maximized every resource, stretched every bullet. Their fighters trained for extreme endurance, marching for days without rest, moving across impossible terrain, surviving with little food or water. The idea was simple: make every action count. Every bullet had to matter. Every movement had to serve a purpose. There was no room for waste. The doctrine also meant that TPLF soldiers had to be the best, not in sheer numbers, but in skill, resilience, and adaptability. Soldiers were trained to be highly mobile, capable of carrying out missions deep into enemy territory with minimal supplies. They were accepted to think on their feet, to solve problems without waiting for orders. They had to be more than just fighters. They had to be survivors, leaders, and problem solvers. The third doctrine was political as much as it was military. From the beginning, the TPLF had embraced democratic principles within their movement, and they had extended this into their military. Leadership was not absolute. Decisions were debated, questioned, and refined. Soldiers were not just fighters. They were political actors, participants in their own destiny. Orders were given, but they were also discussed. Every soldier had to understand not just what they were doing, but why. This internal democracy was essential for maintaining morale. Soldiers who felt they had a voice, who understood the larger purpose for their mission, fought harder. They were not pawns in someone else's game. They were part of the decision-making process. This made them more committed, more disciplined, and more willing to endure hardships. It also endured that leadership was held accountable. Commander could not simply make reckless decisions. Every action had to be justified, debated, and agreed upon. Now going into the military philosophy changes. The TPLF recognized that war was not fought solely on the battlefield. There was a front, and there was a rear. The front was where the battles took place, the military struggle itself. But the rear, that was the people. Without the people, there was no war, no revolution. Winning the support of the population was not an afterthought. It was the foundation of every victory. Every action taken had to strengthen the bond between the TPLF and the communities they moved through. Every village they passed through had to see them as not an occupying force, but as their own, in the same prosecution the people felt. For a decade, the TPLF had been on the defensive. That was over. The new strategy was clear. Take the initiative. Attack first. Keep the enemy off balance. The moment the Derg was reacting instead of acting, they were losing. And even in moments where the Derg launched offensive attacks, the TPLF counter-strategy was simple: attack while defending. The idea was to force the Derg to defend their own positions, even when they were supposedly on the offense. If the enemy was fighting on their own soil, they weren't attacking yours. For example, in a football game, if you were attacking and were in your opponent's half with the ball, then they couldn't score on you. TPLF's idea is the same. Keep the enemy in their own half and just keep attacking. Another military concept that was adapted, the idea that knowing the enemy was crucial. Their numbers, their training, their weakness. The TPLF studied the Derg's forces carefully. For example, they understood that the Derg soldiers were often forced into service, motivated, and lacked conviction in their cause. Like the TPLF fighters, were not ready to lay down their lives for their cause and leaders. And this weakness, it could be exploited. One of the most advanced concepts that the TPLF incorporated was inspired by physics, the idea that everything had a quote-unquote center of gravity. The concept was every military force has a center of gravity, a focal point that holds its operations together. It could be a command post, a supply line, or a crucial piece of terrain. The strategy was methodical. Find the enemy's center of gravity, destroy it, and then dismantle everything else. Battles were no longer just about killing enemy soldiers. They were about breaking the very structure that held them together. But knowing how to strike wasn't enough. Timing was everything. If the TPLF identified a weak point in the Derg's forces but moved too soon, they risked exposing themselves before the enemy was truly vulnerable. If they struck too late, they allowed the Derg time to regroup. The principle was clear: strike at the right moment, and when you do, commit fully. Finally, the last key principle of the TPLF's military science was adaptability. No unit could afford to rest. The moment a mission was completed, the fighters had to be ready to assist in another. Mobility and flexibility were crucial. When the TPLF won a battle, they did not stop to celebrate. They moved on to the next fight. It was this relentlessness that made them impossible to contain. These doctrines and strategies changed everything. The TPLF was no longer just a movement. It was an army. It was no longer just surviving. It was winning. The Derg had more weapons, more men, more money. But the TPLF had something stronger: strategy, conviction, and the willingness to fight smarter. And as the war continued, one thing became clear. The Derg was no longer fighting a rebellion. It was fighting an enemy that had figured out how to win. The next phase of the war had begun, and this time, it was the TPLF that was in control. A single victory can change the course of a war, but a sequence of victories, that changes history. By the late 1980s, the TPLF had transformed from an insurgent group into a formidable military force, capable of toppling the very foundation of the Ethiopian regime. And it all began with a decisive strike, one that shattered the illusion of Derg's invincibility. The Battle of Shire, a turning point. 604th Corps of the Derg, a force made up of various divisions, experienced generals, heavily armed battalions. They had the numbers, they had the firepower. But what they didn't have, the resolve of the TPLF. For 3 relentless days, battle raged. The TPLF, outgunned, outmanned, yet unshaken, executed a calculated strategy that would change everything, and by the end, the 604th Corps lay in ruin. The Derg's military command in Tigray had been dismantled, and with it, the regime's grip on the region. The tide had turned. But the war did not end in Shire. This was just the beginning. With momentum on their side, the TPLF pressed forward. Their next target? Gobo, in the Amara region. Here, the 605th Corps of the Derg awaited, confident in their defenses. Confidence means nothing against an army that fights with purpose. TPLF struck with precision, dismantling another core of the regime's forces. Gobo fell, and with it, the road to the heart of Ethiopia was opened. There was no time to slow down. War rewarded the bold, the relentless, the ones who never let their enemy breathe. In Gunna and Debre Tabor, TPLF expanded the battlefield, launching a simultaneous offensive across multiple fronts. The strategy was clear: keep the enemy disorientated, stretched thin, unable to mount a coordinated defense. And so they pushed west, entering Welega through the Oromo region. Other forces were fighting through different paths. The capital, Addis Ababa, was no longer a distant goal. It was now within reach, and the people knew it. The people had seen armies before. They had seen oppression and occupation, who promised one thing and delivered another. But this was different. TPLF soldiers were not conquerors, they were liberators. They spoke the language of the people, shared their struggle, understood their pain, and as they entered town after town, city after city, they were not met with fear. They were met with open arms, because this war was not just about taking land. It was about winning trust. As TPLF got closer and closer to the capital, not everyone wanted to see them enter into the city. The international community, wary of what came next, arranged negotiations. In London, under the mediation of the United States, TPLF representatives sat across from the remnants of the Derg regime. The message was clear. Western powers doubted the TPLF's ability to govern. They called them inexperienced, unprepared, incapable of managing an entire nation. But history belongs to those who take action. The TPLF leaders listened. Then they left. They did not need permission to end this war and decided not to listen. The representatives returned to their country. Not the Derg representatives, as they probably saw the writing on the wall. The last stronghold of the Derg was within sight, but Mengistu would not let power slip away so easily. The Ethiopian military had one final play. 10 divisions, 84,537 combatants, over 1,000 heavy artillery units, tanks, rocket launchers, air superiority, force designed to crush an enemy in one swift stroke. And yet, the strategy was familiar. Shock and overwhelm. The Ethiopian forces had launched an all-out assault, attacking from multiple fronts, pushing with sheer brute force. For 72 hours, the offensive seemed unstoppable. Airstrikes, artillery bombardments, mechanized divisions storming forward. But war is not won in the first strike. The TPLF, outnumbered as always, held their ground. They absorbed their initial attack, then countered. The terrain, once again, was their weapon. Narrow valleys became death traps for tanks, hillsides became sniper nests, and slowly the momentum shifted completely. Every army has a center of gravity, the core that holds it together. Find it, destroy it, and the rest collapses. The TPLF identified the weak points. The 21st Division was lured into a trap and wiped out. The 17th Division was encircled and annihilated. One by one, the offensive lost steam. Soldiers defected. Officers fled. And at last, the Ethiopian war machine, once thought to be an immovable force, came crashing down. And so, the capital stood alone, isolated, surrounded, defenseless. The Derg leaders, seeing the inevitable, fled. They had ruled with fear, with force, with brutality, and yet, in the end, they could not even stand and face their own defeat. The revolution had come, and it was unstoppable. Wars are often won long before the final battle. Sometimes victory is not about brute force, but about patience, about restraint, about knowing when to strike. As the TPLF forces closed in on Addis Ababa, they stood on the principle of final triumph. But they did not rush. They did not storm the city in a blaze of gunfire, because the true objective was not just taking the capital, it was taking it without destroying it. The path to Addis Ababa was open. The Derg regime was broken, its forces shattered across the country. The capital lay vulnerable, its defenses in disarray, and yet the TPLF did something that few victorious armies would consider. They stopped. They did not march forward. They waited, because they knew that entering Addis Ababa, the remnants of the Derg's forces were still inside, would mean chaos, street-to-street combat, destruction, the deaths of thousands of civilians. This was not a war for conquest. This was a war for liberation. They stayed true to the first principle in their new doctrine. Every action they took was in consideration of human rights. For days, the TPLF forces remained just outside the city, close enough to strike, deliberately holding back. But this pause was not inaction. It was a strategy, one built on patience and understanding. They knew that the Derg would not sit idle. Mengistu, clinging to power, had no choice but to present himself as in control. He used the TPLF's restraint as propaganda, declaring to the people that he had stopped them before they entered into the capital, that his forces were holding the rebels back at bay. Mengistu was about to make a fatal mistake. TPLF needed the Derg to come out, so they provoked him. Small and calculated attacks on military positions just outside the city, designed not to break through, but to draw Mengistu's forces out. Make him react, to make him believe he still had the upper hand. And just as expected, the Derg took the bait. Mengistu ordered his troops to engage, lead them beyond the city's perimeter, believing that they could push the rebels back. It was the last command he would ever give as a ruler of Ethiopia, because the moment these forces left the city, they were walking into a trap. The fighting was swift, precise, decisive. The last of Derg's loyalists, forced into open confrontation, were torn apart by the TPLF that had spent years mastering the art of guerrilla warfare. By the time Mengistu understood what happened, it was too late. His army was gone, his power was gone, his fate was sealed. On that day, as his capital fell, Mengistu Haile Mariam did not stand and fight. He did not rally his forces, did not defend his power anymore. He ran. He fled to Zimbabwe, where an old ally, Robert Mugabe, welcomed him with open arms. He left behind a nation scarred by war, by terror, by years of brutality, but he did not leave behind his defiance. In exile, he issued one last threat. I will see the death of all of you, referring to the TPLF leaders, before you see my death. Yet, as history has shown, eerily, this statement did not come to be untrue. Mengistu still resides in Zimbabwe today. And so after years of struggle, after battles fought in the mountains, in the valleys, in the heart of Ethiopia, the war was over. The people poured into the streets, not in fear, but in celebration. The capital had not been taken by force. It has been freed by patience, by strategy, by a movement that understood the power of restraint. Addis Ababa belonged to its people once more. But victory does not stop at defeating an enemy. It is about what comes after, about what is built in the wake of war. And on that day, in Addis Ababa, a new chapter of Ethiopian history began, a chapter not written by the Derg, not by Mengistu, but by the people who had fought and endured and finally triumphed.